All right. So, when Sharon asked me to do this, I thought she was a little crazy, and I'm probably a little crazier for accepting. And then I got kind of excited because, there's a lot of things that I've been studying. I'm like, oh, I finally get to share what I've been doing. But God's He's kind of shifted me away from what I wanted to do originally. I still get to do it, but He said you need to lay a foundation with your testimony. And so that's what I'm going to do today. And just bear with me. And if I start talking too fast, just tell me to stop and slow down, because I might do that. So I was born into a Christian home. Growing up, my dad was a pastor at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and church was really central to everything we did. I mean, we were at church on Saturday, we were on church on Wednesdays, on Friday nights. I went to a church school. All my friends were from church. My dad did revival meetings. We went to church camp. I went to church summer camp. All our social events were church events. Like, everything revolved around church. And at home, we were doing morning and nightly devotionals. My dad was always, he would wake up in the morning, and he's down there at 2 o'clock praying and studying over his sermon. It was just, that was our life. We were encouraged to study the Bible on our own, and God was just really freely spoken in our home. The blessing in this is I never questioned whether God was real. Like, He was just such a part of our lives. I seen Him in everything. Some people have to search their whole life just to find out that one question: does God exist? It was never an issue. And I think that was really fundamental in my walk with God, because I just knew He was real. So you would think with that kind of solid base that I would be a pretty mature Christian by now. But, it couldn't be further from the truth. I knew a lot about religion growing up, and I knew a lot about what was expected of me. And I had a lot of knowledge about the Bible, but it was pretty misguided. There was several things, when I was being raised Adventist, there were a lot of things that are stressed as important, or at least that I viewed as, staples of the church. And they all revolved around this one principle of obedience and respect for God's law. The first thing was you honored the Sabbath. And this meant that, Saturday was the true Sabbath. Growing up Adventist, that's their big thing. And it should be honored as it's commanded in the Bible. So what this meant in our family was, starting Friday night, we turned the TV off, we turned the radio off, you didn't work. Anything that was secular, you put it away, and you spent that time focusing on God and how you could honor God. And Saturday until sunset was just more of the same. Anything that would distract from focus on God was just a big no. The second important thing that I was taught growing up Adventist is that God had given us a health message. And a health message. What this meant was that they followed the dietary laws of the Old Testament. So, we weren't allowed to eat pork or anything that was, seafood, that kind of stuff. And there was a really big focus on, like, home remedies and natural, not healing, but, trying to get well without going to the doctor or without having to take medicine. We were just taught our bodies are the temple of God, and we're not going to dishonor them with what we put in. And so even if maybe the Bible didn't talk about it specifically, kind of like caffeine, we weren't allowed to do that, because it would alter our body, and that would lead us astray from God. the last thing that I think stood out in my mind, and I don't know that the church would agree with me if I were to ask them, but modesty was like a huge push in our church and in our home. You know, had my dad had it his way, I would have wore like turtlenecks and a long dress with clothes underneath, just for good measure. You know, jewelry, anything like that. You just, you know, why? But their question was why. I remember a teacher in high school talking about wedding rings, and he said, why do you have to wear a for sale sign if you don't act like you're for sale? And that was the focus. I mean, like, why are you drawing attention to yourself? Just, and so that always stood out in my mind as the third thing that really shaped the church. As a young kid, all those things, they weren't that important, or they didn't make that big of a deal in my life. You know, we just did whatever. And sometimes Dad would say, oh, no, you can't do that. And it would be annoying or frustrating, and you get over it and you go do something else. But it didn't, you know, it wasn't something that I saw as that big of a deal. My faith was pretty simple. You know, I loved God. I wanted to be His. And so I think I was about 7 when I decided to be baptized. It was as I started getting older that I really started to struggle with my faith, because somewhere along the way I stopped seeing God as like a loving father. And I started viewing Him as a dictator who just threw out rules just to watch us struggle to keep them. And, you know, I didn't understand the beliefs of the church. And I just knew that they were required. And my views of God was tied directly to my views of the church. And I just grew really bitter and angry with God and with the church. I viewed, you know, they had these lists of do's and don'ts. And that was our life. It was like, you can do this, you can't do that. You know, you're planning what you're going to do, and my dad's going through a checklist of, you know, this is what you're allowed to do. So for the most part, I hated the restrictions that were on us. You know, I hated the way that they separated me from everyone that wasn't in our church. And even some people that were in the church seemed to be so much freer and happier than we were, or than I was. And I remember I would watch the clock on Saturdays, you know, just counting the hours until the sun went down so life could resume some type of normalcy. My family was the only Adventist on both my mom and my dad's side. So, you know, if you went anywhere with family, it was just like a slap in the face how different life was. You know, they were either going to church on Sunday or they didn't go at all. And they could dress however they wanted to. You know, they were allowed to go to the movies and to ball games, and they just seemed to be so much freer. And they were able to do all these things that we weren't allowed to do. And then if you went to church with them, they were like Assembly of God, most of them. So, you know, you had this pastor who's shouting and people are jumping pews, and that part was a little crazy. But, I mean, it was way more exciting than our church was, where you just sit there and silent and don't be heard. So I just, you know, I just felt different from them. And I remember I would go visit them, and it was like the simplest things, like they would serve pork and our bacon, and, you know, we're not going to eat that. And then they would make comments about, well, you know, your dad is wrong in that, or the church's view is wrong in that. And then I would feel obligated to defend it, which was frustrating because I'm defending something I don't understand, I don't even like, but it's my dad, and it's the only thing that I know. And so it caused a lot of conflict in me and with those around me. And then there was just this guilt that came with that standard of living. You know, you would do something that you knew you weren't supposed to do, and I would feel like I had let God down. And so my focus really became about living up to those standards. Like, you have to be good enough. And If I did it well, then I was a good Christian. But if I did something wrong or I wasn't feeling God's presence, I was just a failure. And, this became like a really vicious cycle in my life. Just you would try and you would fail and you would try and you would fail. And you would get like this close to thinking you had it all together and you were finally good enough that you were going to have this great relationship with God. And then you would do something wrong and it just crumbles and you have to pick up and start it all over again. So at about 15, I went to the pastor at the time of the church and I told him, I think I need to be rebaptized because, I'm failing miserably. And looking around, everybody else seemed to have it so much more together than me. And I just figured I had missed something. I was young the first time. I must have missed something. So I went through the study to hopefully to find whatever I had missed. But really all I walked away with was this further affirmation that I had to honor God by doing, like by being able to keep that standard. I remember when I went to be baptized, standing in the water, and the pastor says, Sarah, will you honor God by keeping the Sabbath? Will you honor him by not drinking caffeine? Will you honor him by not having sex outside of marriage? Like there was this extensive list. I don't remember it all. But it was part of what you agreed to before you went down into the water. And, so when I went down and I came back up just even more determined that I had to meet the standard of living. My salvation hinged on being able to be good enough for God. And then, life happens. And you can't keep that standard. I know y'all probably know that at the time, though that was just my view of God. I guess I was about 15, and I got into a relationship with a guy who was like 6 or 7 years older than I was. And in my mind, I'm like 15 going on 25. In reality, I'm 15 going on 15. And I was way in over my head. And that relationship ended disastrously. And the guilt and the shame from that it was really overwhelming. And I just remember I wasn't going to breathe a word to anyone about my failures because everyone else was doing so much better. Like, there was nobody saying, I'm failing miserably. I was the only one, I felt like. And so I felt like such a failure. And it was the first time I felt like I had crossed a line that I couldn't come back from. And I spent years trying to make it up to God. But, obviously, you can never be good enough. In fact, I just kept spiraling further down. The older I got, the more temptations there were. There were boyfriends, and there was drinking, and there were parties, and there were, you get your own vehicle, and there's a chance to do things that your dad and your mom are like, oh, no, you can't. Well, they're not here, and they don't know. And all those things kind of just found their way into my life. I was still trying to be good enough, but I couldn't. And then slowly it turned into, I didn't really want to. And I thought, maybe it's not as important to God as I think it is. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe it doesn't matter. And the beliefs of this work-based salvation that I had it was like a daily reminder that I'm a failure. And I got to the point I didn't want a God who was okay with making somebody feel like that every day. So at about 19, I had enough, and I just quit. Like, I walked away from the church, and I wasn't praying. I wasn't opening my Bible. I just remember thinking, I can be a good Christian and be miserable doing it while I fail and go to hell, or I can do whatever I want, be happy doing it. I'll still go to hell. They both end in hell. Just how do you want to get there? I didn't want to get there being miserable my whole life. So this just led to several years of very self-centered living. You know, there were times where I would feel the Spirit, you know, trying to pull me back, and I was very resistant. I didn't want to go back to being reminded every day that I'm a failure.
Were you angry?
I was very angry, very angry. You know, and this led to a lot of mistakes, sins that even now cause a lot of shame and remorse. I know that I'm forgiven, but every time that I'm reminded of my past, I have buyer's remorse. You know, the sins were mine, and I was happy to do them at the time. I was happy to live that lifestyle. But now that I understand God's grace and God's love for me, you know, there's nothing that I wouldn't give to go back and to be able to honor him with my life and to not have wasted literally, you know, years and years of my life doing things that took me nowhere. I remember during this period, I would have the thought, at some point I have to go back, because I was smart enough even then to know that, you know, that kind of lifestyle wasn't productive just to be a good citizen, much less a good Christian. But I just, you know, someday I will, was how I kind of looked at it. And there were times that I would make an effort, but the reminder that you're not good enough comes so quick, and then, you know, you just, yeah, he does, right? Yeah. And I would just, you know, I would stop because it was never worth the frustration and the heartache that it caused to try to be good enough.
Well, you didn't know the difference between Jesus and his presence in your life and the church. And the church
right.
represented iron walls, and you didn't want to go back to that. And you
That's
didn't know
true.
any other way to find God except in that church.
And that's very true. It was during this time that I met Virgil. And after a couple of years, we were married. And, you know, looking back, God kind of used Virgil, I think, to snap me back a little, because Virgil was a lot wilder than I was. And seeing his lifestyle made me rethink mine. Like, I knew that that's not, I wanted kids, and I didn't want that lifestyle if I was going to have kids. So by the time Amos came around, like, I was done drinking, I was done partying. I thought, you know, by outward standards, I was probably a pretty good citizen. You know, I had a good job. I was respected in what I did. Yeah, and I knew that I needed to get back to God, but I really struggled, because now not only did I not understand how you do that, but I had a kid, and I had a marriage, and I had a home to keep, and a job that was really high stress, and I didn't even know where I would fit God in if I ever knew how to have a relationship with him. But with each kid, you know, Emma came, and then with Owen, and with each one of them, like, just the conviction that I needed God just grew stronger. And so it was about the time that Owen was born, my mom and dad's church got a new pastor, and he went out of his way to try to draw me back. And he didn't use the same methods that the pastors in the past had, and he didn't preach the same message that the other ones did. You know, he spent a lot of time just harping on, God loves you, and he wants you, and he has a plan for you. And not to say that none of the other pastors had ever said that, it seemed more real this time. Like, maybe there was something that I actually had missed, or, you know, and there was a chance to have a relationship with God that didn't end with me being a failure on a daily basis. So I took a position leading a Friday night Vespers at that church, and God really used that to grow me, because when you're ministering to others, I have to be in the Word, and so I was learning a lot of truths about God that, you know, looking back, I don't want to lay everything on the church's feet. Because like I said, you know, there were people in there who seemed really happy, and they were really happy because they had the truth that I was missing. And I think I spent a lot of time just being bitter and angry instead of getting in the Word and searching it out for myself. If I didn't understand it, if I didn't agree with it, instead of just turning away, I should have dug a little deeper. And so that was what God was working in me at that time was, you need to dig a little. Let's figure this out. And so I started making some changes in my life at that time. I started reading my Bible every day and praying. And even some of the little things I did, like switching to just listening to Christian music. Because I think it was my dad said, what you put in, you get out. And so I just started to, in everything I did, I started trying to involve God and focus on God. And it helped. I was still struggling because even now, or even then, that I was able to separate God from this crazy
religious structure.
Yes, I still struggled with not knowing how to get to him. There was just always this wall, that you hit. And I still had that misguided belief that I needed to achieve some level of holiness before he would accept me. In my mind, I thought at some point you're going to have like this life-shattering conversion, and that would end all my doubts and all my temptations and all my struggles, and I would just, I would be able to feel God's love just pouring into me, and it would just consume me. And that's not reality, and it's definitely not my story. So I came to the point where I hit the same wall that I always hit, which is I can't be good enough for God. And it was at the point where normally I would just throw up my hands and walk away and just go back to doing whatever. Until, not doing what I knew was right outweighed the frustration of knowing that I couldn't do it. This time, though, God intervened. I remember that moment really well. I came home from church, and I was so mad at God. And I sat in my living room, and I screamed at him. I'm like, where are you? I was so angry because I didn't understand how he could ignore me when I was trying so hard. And I was searching for him, and he felt like a phantom to me. Just this unattainable treasure that I was just always out of my reach. And it was in that moment that God spoke the most simple truth in my heart. And he just said, I'm here. Like, the very fact that you care whether or not you have a relationship with me is proof that I'm here. And, it was like 30-something years of my life climaxed at that moment. And suddenly it didn't matter how much I felt, because God was there and he wanted me. And it's hard to explain why such a simple truth that I've heard like a million times made such a difference, other than to say it was just God's word and God's timing. And it was mind-altering to me, because if the struggle to do good was evidence that God was present in my life, there wasn't a time looking back over my life that God wasn't there. And there was never a time that he hadn't been seeking a relationship with me. And God just kept confirming this truth in my life everywhere I turned. Every scripture I read, every sermon that was preached, you turn the radio on and everybody was talking about it. Like suddenly, God was everywhere, and I just want you and I'm here for you. That message just was everywhere. And for the first time, I understood that God's love for me didn't hinge on what I did. He loved me in spite of everything. And my sins weren't new to God. He knew all of them. I think I'd spent so much of my life trying to, I knew that you can't hide stuff from God, but you can try, And I did. I spent a lot of time trying to hide this stuff from God. And suddenly, I believed when it said you can't hide anything. And it was such a relief because he knew it all and he loved me. And it was a love that was, before the earth began, he knew what I was going to do. And he loved me anyways. Yes. And I knew that any good works or desires in my life were simply God at work in me. So every success I had, was faith building because it spoke of God's presence in my life. Now that God had my full attention, he started to work on me pretty quick. The first thing he showed me was I had commitment issues, which needed to be resolved. To me, commitment was always kind of synonymous with compromise or surrender. And that wasn't something that I was fond of. Growing up, my dad wanted us to be independent and to be able to stand on our own. And I had built this whole life, this whole persona that I was this independent person able to do whatever you set before me. And I didn't want to be seen as weak. But that's what God was telling me. You have to surrender. And he just kept at me until that message of surrender, it was like it became a theme in my life. And a broken record, if you will. Apparently, life wasn't about doing for God. It was just about surrendering to God and then letting him work through me. And so God's truth, it didn't change my struggles. The struggles that I'd had 2 minutes before he said I'm here were still the ones that I had 2 minutes afterwards, and 2 weeks, and some of them even like 2 years after I had heard from God. I had a marriage that was like in desperate need of saving. I felt like I was a complete failure as far as parenting went. I had a job that I took a lot of pride in, but it robbed me of time with my family. It robbed me of just peace. It was just a job that revolved around chaos, and that's all I knew was how to keep the chaos in check. And I was just, as I started to surrender to God, I started seeing God move so much in my life. The first major move God gave me was a desire for church, this church. Even though at the time I had been coming here for a while, I never felt like it was home. I believed that Saturday was the Sabbath day, and I came here only because I knew that it was important to come with Virgil and the kids. And I had spoken so badly of my parents' church when me and Virgil met that he wanted nothing to do with that. So my option was to come here with him, or we just didn't go to church together. And I was I didn't know why, God would call me here if Saturday was the true day. But, he was calling me here, and he was telling me this was home. And the more I came, the more it felt like home. And then the more I wanted to come. And then I needed to come because it brought encouragement into my life. And it was helping me to grow. And so I made, that was the first commitment I think that I made was I stopped going to church on Saturday. I would go sometimes if my dad asked me to, but that was not my church anymore. This was my home.
Look forward to going to church.
I do.
It's exciting. Boy, it's Sunday. I get to go to church this morning.
Yeah.
And this is the only church that's ever happened.
And when I made that commitment to come here, and to focus all my efforts and my attention on the church that God had called me to, he opened up so many doors. he opened up the praise team, and then he opened up the band, and and coming to church stopped being so much about being served as it did to serving. And I can't stress how important it is to get out of the pew and do something. If you're not allowing God to work through you, then you're missing such a blessing that he has for your life. God wants to grow us, but a lot of times growth comes with surrender of our focus on ourselves and our needs. And so he was using the ministry and the church and Bruce and Sharon to grow me and to encourage me and to challenge me. And the more I surrendered to God, the more of a work that he did in me. And when I felt like I had that solid base, like that I had my support team in place, then God kind of moved on to my marriage. God doesn't cause bad things to happen to us, but I think he allows them sometimes when they're going to be for our benefit. And, when God started working in my life, Satan started working overtime on me too. It seemed like every step I took towards God was a step out of my marriage. It felt like Virgil and I were in two different boats, on two different oceans, headed in two different directions. And I really struggled with the thought, I didn't think I could serve God and be married to Virgil. It seemed like everything about my marriage was a struggle between either satisfying Virgil or honoring God. And then, just for good measure, Satan threw temptation at me of greener grass on the other side. And I'll be honest, I teetered on the fence for a minute, not because I wanted some physical relationship with somebody, but it was the promise of a friendship that made me think twice. There was a tragedy that happened, and it brought this guy back into my life who was a childhood friend. And suddenly I had somebody I felt like cared how my day was going. Would call to see if I was handling everything that was going on all right, and who was honest enough to say, you know what, I'm struggling. Like, I don't know what to do today. And that openness led to reminiscing about, the good old days and the thought of, I wonder what life would be like if we had gotten together. And that led to sharing about, how our marriages were not great and how we were failing, and just giving each other advice. And I allowed him to feel a need in me that only belonged to Virgil. And I realized that the friendship was unhealthy, and it was moving in a direction that I had no desire to go. But at that point, I was afraid to just be like, you know what, we probably need to not be friends anymore, because I knew our conversations had been inappropriate, and if I stepped out, he might say something, and I didn't want anybody to know that I had been tempted. But that's exactly what happened.
It is.
Yeah.
To all of us.
Yeah. Well, but that's what happened. So everything came out, and I was relieved. Like, honest to goodness, I was just relieved because I didn't have to do anything. It was all done, and I could just walk away. I felt horrible about it, and suddenly I was terrified. Not terrified like I had been beforehand, that people would just know, but I was suddenly terrified because I realized what I stood to lose. And, as bad as my marriage was, I wanted it. And
You're a human being, girl.
yeah. Well, it was, God used that. He did the most amazing thing, because Virgil's a normally no room for error kind of guy. And so I was really worried when I told him that he would just walk away. And if he didn't walk away, he would just hold it over my head forever. And like everything I did would just come back to that. And Virgil, though, showed me like the most grace, like the most amazing, undeserving grace. And the more I tried to explain to him that I didn't deserve it, because I had betrayed us, he showed me more grace. And that grace, it was so parallel to the grace that God shows us. It it was overwhelming. And so I walked away understanding God better, and I walked away with a new appreciation and respect for my husband. Now, that didn't change any of the other problems that we had, but it made me a little bit more willing to work on the other problems. But we were still, even at that point, we were really struggling, because that had made me realize that I wanted a friendship with Virgil, and we didn't have that. I wanted a conversation that didn't revolve around our, paying the bills, or what the kids' schedule was, or that didn't end, in a fight. And we didn't have that. I wanted Virgil to be devoted to God. I wanted him to want to lead our family.
You got a dead body in here?
Close. I wanted him to be the spiritual leader of my home, and he didn't have any desire to do that. He would come to church, but I felt like I was dragging him and the kids to church, and he just had no initiative of his own to have that relationship with God. And it was still the struggle of satisfying Virgil or honoring God. And so our marriage was still just rock bottom bad. And that's when God used Bruce and Sharon to come in, and they counseled us. They were able to just talk with us and share with us that, some of the struggles that we have aren't unique to me and Virgil. And I think that's a lie that the devil so often tells us, is your struggles are unique only to you. Nobody else is feeling this bad. I feel like that was a theme throughout my life. And so you don't want to share it. And then when somebody says, you know what, we went through the same thing, it's just like this huge weight falls off your shoulders that maybe you're not as bad as you thought you were. And when you look at them and you think, well, theirs seems so great, it's hope that, well, maybe one day ours will seem so great as well. And so they spent a lot of time, just giving us advice and encouragement and resources that we could do to work on our marriage. And, now our marriage isn't perfect. We still struggle with some of the same things that we've always struggled with.
Sarah, you're building a marriage.
I know.
Something that you're like, you bought this new house and it's already, you are building a marriage.
Oh, I know.
On the way to church this morning, I went so dead, just want to punch him dead in the face.
Yeah. Well, that's normal. There's days that I want to throat punch Virgil and then just kick him on the way down.
There's one more time just for good measure.
That's right.
Mr. Annoying has showed up this morning, and by golly, I'm going to have to do today.
So, but, in everything, even with the struggles, I know this truth now. God honors marriage, and he honors my marriage. The moment that I said I do, even if I hadn't sought God out in it, he honors it, and he's committed to it. And if it's important to him, it's important to me. And I know that, as long as I'm willing to let him work through me, that there is hope. And we will get there one day, eventually. And, I can say the same is true for being a parent. As long, it is, it's just a journey, and you learn a little more every day. But I found that as long as I'm willing to go to God and say, I don't have a clue this time, or I failed, like I messed it up really bad, he's always there to come in and fix it. And I know that even on days when I screw it up horribly bad, that God's working on us and his hand is guiding us. And there's nothing that Virgil and I can do that God can't redeem in our children. And so I feel like we walk in victory all the time in that area, even when we're failing, because it's not me, it's God through me. Yes. Another area of commitment that God raised was our finances. When Virgil and I got together and we got married, and I got a job, and then we got a new vehicle because it was a necessity. And then it became about getting vehicles because you wanted a new vehicle that was dependable. And then there was all these cool little things that new vehicles had that old vehicles didn't, which is not a bad thing. But what happened is that we found ourselves like strapped. I mean, we lived paycheck to paycheck, and it was just all about paying the bills. And that's where God came to me when in this area, was just like, you know what, you need to be out of debt. You know, for the first time I was able to look ahead and say, you know, God's leading me somewhere, and being strapped financially is going to hinder what God wants to do in me. And so I had this desire to get out of debt. And then LaTana came in with the Dave Ramsey, which gave us the tools to be out of debt. And so like today, you know, we're just a couple of years from being completely out of debt. And being able to look at all these areas that God has just said, you know what, I want you to commit to something. I want you to focus on this and trust me in it. It makes me realize how good God has been to us and how much He's provided. You know, every time He says do this, He makes a way for it. You know, He gives us something. And I know I've mentioned this before, but like in Exodus 31, it talks about, I can't say his name, so we're just going to call him Bez. But when God wanted to build the sanctuary, He said, I'm going to anoint Bez. I'm going to fill him with my Holy Spirit. And then I'm going to give him everything he needs to do what I want to build this sanctuary. And He listed out, He says, I'm going to give him ability and knowledge and intelligence and craftsmanship and artistic design. And I find that that's the truth in my life as well, is God has called me to serve Him and to surrender to Him. And He provides everything along the way. You know, whether it's been in the music where I just, you know, I remember starting the band, the first practice I came to, and I walked out of here thinking, nope, like, and I was done. And
then you brought me to tears.
yeah, and then Sharon called me the next day, or she texted me, and it wasn't a like, hey, we love you, we want you to come to the band, be part of the band, like, you know, keep this up. It was, you know, God didn't create a spirit of fear in us, and that's all I needed, was to realize that it was fear. And then God has just provided the rest, you know. Whatever it was for music, He's provided. In our finances, you know, when I'm tempted to think, gosh, I need that snowball money that we used to pay off the debt for something else, and suddenly, you know, Virgil decides to pay 2 weeks in advance because he's self-employed, so, you know, he just pays so much out of his business to us, you know, to cover what we need. Or I, you know, think that I can't handle Virgil one more second, or the kids are driving me crazy, and God just brings something, you know, in there that just gets me through. And it always leaves me knowing that God was there. And this has really changed my view of God. I no longer look at God as a dictator who barks orders and sets these unattainable standards and then punishes me when I fail. I'm going to fail. And He loves me. And He wants me to do right. And He wants me to do these things. But that's not what is going to draw Him to me. There's nothing that I can do to make Him love me more than He already does. And, you know, I believe God now when He says that through God all things are possible. You know, when I struggle and Satan tempts you to think there's no way, like you're digging yourself out of this one, and then God comes in and says there's always a way. And He's been so great to us. And I know that, you know, being surrendered to God just means that God is alive and He's well in me. And His strengths are my strengths now. And His abilities are my abilities because He lives in me and He works through me. And I have access to everything that He has and that He is. I used to wonder, back when I was mad at God, why it was so bad for us to want glory for ourselves. But it was okay for God to want it for Himself. And now that, you know, I'm walking closer to God and I have this relationship with Him, I realize He deserves it. He's the only one that deserves it. You know, the good that I do is only because of the good He is in me. He's the only one that deserves it. And I want to give Him the glory and the honor. And I don't think that God is a glory hog. You know, looking back at some of the biggest times that God has moved in my life, He wasn't standing there pounding His chest saying, look at me. He's standing in the side lines waiting for you to notice Him. And it's just, you know, it's given me a whole new outlook on God and appreciation of God. And I just want to do it. You know, I want to live for Him and I want to honor Him and I want to bring Him glory. So, you know, I've learned that there is no once and done conversion like I had hoped at once upon a time. It's just a journey. And you learn a little and you fail a lot, but He walks with you through the whole thing. And as long as we keep surrendering to Him, He's able to keep working through us. Well, okay, so that's my testimony. But I want to move on and talk to you a little about giving your testimony. You know, like I mentioned earlier, I had this plan for what I wanted to teach. Some of the stuff that I've been that God's been working on me and that I've had to study out. And God was like, no, you need to give your testimony because it's the basis for why I study these things out. But I didn't want to give my testimony. You know, it is personal. And you hear these people give testimonies and they talk about how important it is. But to me, first off, I felt like I don't want to share my failures with people. I don't want them to know everything about me. But also, it's not some movie-worthy story, you know? And it's probably everybody else's story in some form or fashion. So why do it? What I've learned, though, is it's so important to have your testimony because it'll be a blessing. It's a blessing to you to go back and to see God moving throughout your life. And it is really personal, but it's your story with God. You know, and if God were sitting right here and you asked Him, hey, tell me your story about Sarah and you, like He would be excited to do it. Like He's proud of where we've came from. Our testimonies are all the same in one way, and that is it shows redemption's story. You know, you do this, and God is this throughout it all. He's always there, and He's so steadfast in it. And, you know, to tell your story, the hope is not that you're just sharing something, you know, and telling a story, but that there's somebody sitting in the pew that needs to know that they're not so different than you. You know, that the struggles and the failures that they have are not unknown to the rest of the world. And being able to see where God has brought you from gives them hope that He can bring them there too. And so I say all this because I'll be teaching for a few weeks off and on. And I want y'all to start coming up with your own testimony. Write it down, you know. Practice it in front of the mirror or while you're doing dishes or driving in the car. And then at the end of the time that I'll be teaching, I want to come back and give y'all the opportunity to share your testimony. And if you absolutely don't want to share your testimony, that's fine. But at least share what it did for you when you sat down and you wrote out your story with God. Because I promise you there are blessings to be found in it.